The American Brain Tumor Association is pleased to welcome you back to our webinar series. Our webinar topic today is Right to Try and Expanded Access, What to Know. My name is Ambreen Mann, Program Manager here at the ABTA, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Kevin Weatherwax is the Managing Director of the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, an Adjunct Associate Clinical Professor in the College of Pharmacy. He also serves as co-chair of the Michigan Medicine Expanded Access Oversight Committee to develop and enhance processes and infrastructure to support treating clinicians interested in providing access to investigational therapies or agents to patients with no alternatives. Kevin is co-principal investigator with Dr. George Mishore on an NIH U01 award promoting a national network for the FDA's Expanded Access Program. Thank you for joining us, Kevin. You may now begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambreen. I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Excellent. So thank you to the ABTA for inviting me to give this webinar series. It's an honor and a privilege. And as Ambreen mentioned, the topic today is right to try and expanded access, what to know. So the plan today will be to go through each of these pathways, to investigational therapeutics. And then at the end, I will go ahead and kind of go through a compare and contrast between these two different programs. So a few disclosures. I do have stock in a companion animal health company called Zomedica Corporation. I am also listed on a provisional patent for a potential COVID-19 treatment. As far as consultancy is concerned, I am the founder and president of a consultancy group providing regulatory support for drug and medical device companies called 360 Scientific LLC. I am also funded by the National Center for the Advancement of Translational Science, the award that Ambreen just mentioned, and also the Clinical Translational Science Award through NCATS. So I'll take you through Right to Try first, and I wanted to start out with a little bit of history of Right to Try. Back in roughly 2013, the Goldwater Institute, which is a libertarian think tank based in Arizona, they initiated a Right to Try campaign, and they further created a model law for states to use as they rolled these out in the respective states. May 2014, Colorado became the first state in our country to enact their own Right to Try law. Interestingly, I was asked to go to then Governor Snyder's office here in the state of Michigan. That was roughly June of 2014, so right after Colorado signed their law. And the purpose of that is the governor's office wanted to understand, the differences, and sort of the pros and cons of both Right to Try and also FDA's existing expanded access pathway, which again, I'll get into in just a moment. So in 2018, just before President Trump signed the Right to Try Act at the federal level, there were 41 states that had signed their own version of the Right to Try law into law. And so you can see the map of the United States here. The states represented in red did not have their own version at a state level of a Right to Try law. But again, in May of 2018, President Trump did sign the Right to Try Act into law. And this picture was posted on the website righttotry.org. And so if any of you had more interest in looking at Right to Try and what it proposes to do and serve, you definitely go to that website and get more details about this. But I did pull this off of that website. Also, this is directly from the righttotry.org website also. And I just wanted to point out the reasons that they gave for Right to Try specifically. The first one is Right to Try is needed because most terminal patients cannot participate in clinical trials. The second is right to try is needed because dying people don't have access to promising treatments once clinical trials are over, even if the drug was successful and will be approved. And the third reason they gave is right to try is needed because the FDA compassionate use process, or their expanded access process, doesn't help enough people. Fourth is right to try is needed because it takes too long for promising treatments to be approved. And then finally, right to try is needed because you shouldn't have to ask the federal government for permission to try to save your own life. So after right to try was enacted, part of the process when this law was enacted is the Food and Drug Administration actually has to administer the Right to Try Act and fit them into existing regulations. And so I have the FDA's webpage for Right to Try here. I do have the link, and I believe the slides will be provided to you later. If you want to go to the FDA's website and learn about how FDA is trying to implement this into the existing regulatory framework. So right to try, I wanted to list some pros and cons. The first con is that the right to try law is only addresses drugs. So medical devices and biologics are not included in the Right to Try Act. So that's definitely a con. Where things get a little bit more tricky to determine if it's a pro or a con is the second point here, which right to try does not require FDA oversight. And I list that as both a pro and a con because, from the right to try movement perspective, that's definitely a pro, and that's one of the things that they highlight as being a success related to the right to try law. Others could argue that that is actually a con, and I'll get into more details about this later. But not having FDA oversight, there's some patient protections that could be argued that this actually poses as a con. An additional item does not require local institutional review board oversight or a local ethics review for that particular use case. Again, I list this as both a pro and a con. The Right to Try movement would definitely call this a success and a pro. Others, again, would argue that by removing institutional review board oversight in things like the informed consent process and other oversight activities could affect patient rights. One neutral aspect of this is Right to Try has no requirement for a pharma company to provide the product. So at that level, it becomes a right to ask at some level there. I just wanted to put this in here too, just related to the uptake of Right to Try. So again, Right to Try was enacted back in May of 2018. Allison Bateman House, who's a close friend of mine and medical ethicist at NYU, she's tracked the law's application, and she estimates that fewer than 10 people have used this pathway to get treatment since it's been passed. She was quoted in a Washington Post article back in August of this year. And I've just recently had another conversation, personal communication with her, and she further noted that most of these were in the oncology space, and one of them was an ALS patient request. Dr. Bateman House did acknowledge that we do not know the extent or the numbers of Right to Try due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, patients that have specifically engaged this pathway for COVID-19, we don't know the details of that. FDA, as I mentioned, is working on some guidance documents specifically related to the reporting of Right to Try cases. And I think we're looking at January of 2021, where there will be a requirement for manufacturers to actually post the number of Right to Try cases that they have engaged. So we should know more details about that at that point in time on exactly what those numbers are. So now we'll move into the expanded access. I also put in parenthetical here that this is often called pre-approval access as well. So expanded access is a direct term and a pathway through the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So what is expanded access? Again, sometimes called compassionate use. In the setting of investigational drugs, biologics, and medical devices outside the clinical trial setting. And this is specifically for treatment purposes. This is not a research study activity, and it's not clinical trials. For expanded access, you have to have these, the following has to apply for you to be eligible for expanded access. A patient has to have a serious disease or condition, or whose life is immediately threatened by their disease or condition. There is no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. Patient enrollment in a clinical trial is not possible, and the patient benefit justifies the potential risks, and it will, again, not interfere with investigational trials that are ongoing. So there are many stakeholders in the expanded access process. First and foremost, the patient. Other stakeholders include the community, the industry. Obviously, the manufacturer has to be involved to provide the investigational agent for the expanded access case. Obviously, the Food and Drug Administration, the Institutional Review Board. I put the Clinical Translational Science Award consortium because it's a network of 62 funded centers around the country. So University of Michigan happens to have one of these CTSA awards. The hospital or the clinic and then the individual physician are all stakeholders in the expanded access process. A little bit of history of expanded access. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, FDA created the expanded access pathway. And this was really due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic that was happening at that time. In 2016, FDA issued a new guidance document and the Form 3926. I'll go into a little bit more detail about this later, but what this did in 2016, with this Form 3926, it made the process for the clinician requesting the expanded access much easier. It went literally down to, I think, a page and a half of information that needed to be submitted to the FDA. Thus making the process much more efficient and much less burdensome for the clinician. In 2019, the FDA Oncology Center for Excellence establishes Project Facilitate, and I'll go into more details about that in just a minute. This is a screenshot of FDA's Expanded Access Program webpage. There's a lot of really good information within FDA's website. That wasn't the case maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where it was very, very difficult to be able to navigate FDA's overall website. But within the last few years, they've really made it easy to navigate. And again, specifically on expanded access, there's a lot of really great information on their web pages for the FDA Expanded Access Program. So expanded access or pre-approval access, pros and cons. One of the cons is the process historically has been a bit clunky, especially for those not familiar with the process. And what I mean by clunky is, how you had to apply for this through the FDA. There was a fair amount of paperwork until in 2016, the FDA created this new Form 3926. So again, historically, the process has been clunky and a bit burdensome, but FDA has gone to great lengths to improve that process. So here's another pro and con. Because expanded access does require FDA approval and oversight. Again, some could argue that that's a pro because that is another avenue for patient safety. The right to try movement would argue that that is a con because it's, they would argue that it's bureaucratic, and why should the federal government be part of those treatment plans? So again, the requirement for local institutional review board oversight with the expanded access process, again, I list that as a pro and con for the reasons that we discussed about FDA approval oversight and with right to try. Again, neutral because the expanded access process, there is no requirement for the pharma company to provide the product. So FDA issued the guidance document, this guidance document in June of 2016, and they titled it Expanded Access to Investigational Drugs for Treatment Use, Questions and Answers. So this is a great guidance document for those interested in the expanded access pathway. And again, there's a lot of great information in here. And as I mentioned earlier, FDA did issue the second guidance document in June of 2016, which was the Individual Patient Expanded Access Applications Form FDA 3926. So I described this already, so I won't go into any further detail, but just to say that this process has greatly made this process much more efficient for the clinician and reduced a lot of burden. I mentioned Project Facilitate earlier. So again, this is through the Oncology Center of Excellence. And what Project Facilitate is effectively a call center where clinicians that want to provide their patients with a form of treatment through expanded access, the clinician can actually call. They have staff on call, I believe 24 hours a day, where a clinician will talk to a real person that will help them through the process. So help them complete that Form 3926, help them consider what to say to a manufacturer to ask for the product. And oftentimes the FDA will actually contact the manufacturer on behalf of the clinician. Also, the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration, they developed what they call an expanded access navigator. And there's a lot of great information on their website about this expanded access navigator. There's a lot of detail about how to get through the process, who do you need to call, what forms need to be filled out, and so forth. And then just within the last few months, the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration actually added an expanded access e-request. So you don't have to fill out paperwork. You can actually go to their site and complete an electronic form, and it will go through the process, and FDA will be able to look at it in electronic format. So that obviously becomes really important from the global pandemic that we're under with COVID-19. So I put this, I like to show this slide because this is the workflow specifically for expanded access at my institution of Michigan Medicine. And the reason I like to show this is because not only on the left-hand side can you see the number of stakeholders internal to our institution, but also the process that we have to go through just at our institution. And so when I mentioned, one of the cons earlier of expanded access being a bit clunky, this is really what I'm speaking to. And so, we've done a lot of work at Michigan Medicine related to expanded access, and where we started initially was the workflow and how does it work through Michigan Medicine at our own institution. You can see it. There's a lot of stakeholders, and there's a lot of details that have to sort of change hands along the way. So because of that workflow, back in July of 2018, as Ambreen mentioned earlier, I am a co-PI on our grant called Transforming Expanded Access to Maximize Support and Study, or TEAMS. And so we were issued just about $5 million to, again, establish a network of expanded access sites and really work on the process, develop best practices and templates, and again, establish a network-based approach to expanded access to make it easier on everybody involved and those that are engaging the expanded access process. Here's another map of the United States. I just wanted to point out our collaborators. So in addition to Michigan, we are working with the University of Rochester, Duke University, and the University of Texas Southwestern, because we wanted to get a pretty broad geographical spread across the United States as we move forward with the TEAMS award. Just briefly, this is the TEAMS logic model. The idea is to develop, establish best practices, data collection processes, because that's another component that we're really digging into is data collection for these expanded access cases. FDA is amenable to real-world data collection. And so we really want to look at the concept of data collection for these expanded access cases that are occurring. Then we want to demonstrate cohort-based expanded access protocols. So thinking about cohort-based or multiple patient expanded access programs. And again, I mentioned real-world data collection. And then finally disseminate that. And hopefully we will be improving the expanded access process along the way, and then be able to disseminate that around the country. A few key expanded access milestones at Michigan Medicine. In January of 2015, we established the Expanded Access Oversight Committee, which I co-chair. Early in 2016, we created a centralized infrastructure to support expanded access. We really have had an informal infrastructure since 2007. And it's something as simple as creating a joint email address. So in August of 2016, we established a group email address that hits all of the stakeholders that I mentioned on the process map just a few slides ago. But this proved a really critical aspect, just because there's so many stakeholders within our own institution. Having one centralized mode of communication so that everybody gets the information at the same time, again, has been critical to our process. In December of 2016, we modified the institutional review application, review board application, and that went live specifically for expanded access cases, which also really helped the process, which really, for the number of pages that have to be completed for the IRB application, it dramatically reduced that number from regular clinical trials. Further, in 2017, we implemented improved process with our Office of Research and Sponsored Projects, and that specifically relates to contracts and agreements with manufacturers and pharma companies. September 2017, we opened up clinical research space, which allowed space for allocation of expanded access cases and treatments. And then in July 2018, we implemented a policy statement that Michigan Medicine will follow FDA's existing expanded access pathway. Just to give you an idea of the numbers, so this graph represents the number of requests over the years. Beginning in 2009, you can see there was very few requests, all the way to present. So as of October 21st, we've had 236 requests. You can see the darker component of that bar is actually for COVID treatment. And so not surprisingly, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing a lot of activities specifically for COVID-19 treatment. And so also what I wanted to mention, so all of these requests are both single patient requests and also multi-patient expanded access programs. And so those requests over the years have represented well over 1,750 patients that have been treated under this mechanism at Michigan Medicine. And then finally, I wanted to just compare and contrast expanded access and right to try. And so, from a patient concern perspective, access to investigational agents, I already highlighted this, but the FDA's expanded access process does allow for drugs, biologics, and medical devices, where the federal right to try is drugs only. The investigational agent, meaning the phase of the development that that agent is in its development phase. FDA's expanded access can be in any stage. The Federal Right to Try Act, you actually have to have successfully completed phase 1, a phase 1 clinical trial to show safety with that particular product. Ethics review, I spoke about this earlier. It's required under FDA's expanded access, but not required under Federal Right to Try. And then from an accountability standpoint, so under expanded access, the physician obtains institutional review board approval. The informed consent goes through the process of a review with the IRB. They have to report adverse events. They have to maintain accurate case histories, drug disposition records, and at the end of the therapy, they must submit a summary report to the FDA. Under Federal Right to Try, the physician obtains informed consent. There is requirements within the Federal Right to Try law that the informed consent has to have certain elements, but there is not another entity that reviews that informed consent. Informed consent, I just covered that. As far as the investigational agent information is concerned, FDA's expanded access program does look at the investigator's brochure. That's not addressed in the Right to Try Act. Financial responsibility is reviewed by IRB and FDA under expanded access, but not addressed under Right to Try. Conflict of interest reviewed by independent IRB for coercion, exculpatory language, and financial conflict of interest, not addressed with Right to Try. And then finally, safety reporting to FDA. The IND holder is required to report adverse events to the FDA, and that is not required as of right now with a Right to Try. But again, there will be a reporting requirement for companies and manufacturers to report the number of Right to Try cases to the FDA coming in the new year. So with that, I will turn it over to Caitlin. We all have the pleasure of Caitlin joining us today. And Caitlin's going to tell us her story related to how she gained access through FDA's expanded access pathway for a particular drug for her situation. So with that, Caitlin, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Kevin. Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Yeah, we can hear you, Caitlin.
Okay, perfect. So hi, my name is Caitlin Boyle. Excuse the voice, that's from treatment, actually. I have a diffused midline glioma, which is located in the brainstem. It's a brain tumor, and that was diagnosed with that in December of 2017, given about a year to live. So my physicians were looking at all types of up and coming drugs and that type of thing that I could be put on after surgery and radiation. If anybody's gone through chemo with Temodar and radiation, that's what I did. And when I finished with that, Kevin's team at Michigan Medicine, particularly Misty, I always like to give her a shout out because she did so much paperwork for me, my family, while I was recovering and going through these operations. They found a drug for me that was just in some trial phases, but the tumor I have is usually seen in pediatric patients, so I was too old to participate in any of the trials. Therefore, through expanded access, Project Facilitate, and under compassionate use, I was able to get access to the drug that has kept me going for just over 2.5 years. And we just saw progression in the tumor a couple of months ago. So we did radiation again, and we're on to a different drug at the moment. But that was exciting to be a part of, and not only that it worked, obviously that's very exciting, but at Michigan Medicine, it was able to open up a couple of different trials in working through Michigan Medicine and the what do you call it? Expanded access, sorry, that group. So that's kind of my quick version of the story. I'm very happy to have expanded access and Project Facilitate open to different patients, and it's, I guess I didn't have a lot to do with filling out the paperwork. I was busy going through treatment, but luckily their staff was able to help me do that and my family. So with that, if there's any questions, anything, I am more than happy to answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Caitlin.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Caitlin, and for taking some time to share your insight and experience. For our patients and families who are live joining with us now, what advice would you like to share with them as they may be considering investigational therapies? You know,
Sure.
From your personal firsthand experience going through something like this, is there any advice that you'd like to share with others?
Ask all the questions you can think of, and really rely on your medical team for those answers. And your medical team is not just your doctors, it's your people like Kevin, and there's a whole host of people at your hospital working for you that you might not know about. I had no idea Kevin and his team existed, and a lot of the people that I talked to about how I get my drugs and that type of thing, they would never know that Kevin's team existed, which is sad because I think you guys should get way more press than you do because you are responsible for saving so many lives. But unless you ask your doctor or look that up yourself, luckily my doctor is on top of her game all day, every day, and she's a tiger for me. But then I also have my family who's very proactive in research, and they talk to the American Brain Tumor Association, who says, see if your hospital has this in place, and then we find Misty, and then we find Kevin, and so it's really just the support is there, and having worked with the ABTA on a couple of different projects, it's a great national resource. And then Kevin's is his team is a great resource through U of M.
Great, and thank you so much for sharing that advice. I do want to let the audience know that we'll be taking questions live as well. So if you have questions that you'd like to submit for either Caitlin or Kevin, please go ahead and type and submit the questions using the question box on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And Caitlin and Kevin will answer questions as time allows. Caitlin, we have a question here for you. Someone is interested in knowing where you live. So you received your treatments in Michigan. Are you living in Michigan as well?
Yes, I am from Beaver Island, Michigan. I just had to fight the, what do you call it, urge to put my hand up and show you guys where I live. So I live on Beaver Island. It's a really small island in the middle of Lake Michigan. It's about 4.5 hours from Ann Arbor.
Great, thank you. And Kevin, I'm going to direct this question to you. With patients and families who are getting access to treatment through expanded access or right to try, are there financial assistance programs available for them as well? Does their insurance cover treatments like this? What's the financial implication of utilizing investigational treatments through expanded access or right to try?
Yeah, that's a great question. And typically how this works, the the investigational product itself is typically donated by the manufacturer. And I mean, there's very rare exceptions where a manufacturer will charge for the product. And I mean, there's actually a pretty rigorous process that a manufacturer would have to go through to be able to charge for the product. So I think in my 20-year career, I've only ever seen one company actually charge for a product. But again, they have to go through a pretty rigorous process to get approval from the FDA to do that. Now, related to the other considerations, typically we do find that insurance will cover all of the quote-unquote standard of care costs. And again, just remember that this is a form of treatment; it's not research. And so, most, if not all, of the activities for dose administration, follow-up care, labs, procedures, imaging, anything like that is typically covered by the insurance company.
Great, that's good to know. Thank you. And Caitlin, you had mentioned that you live on Beaver Island in Michigan. Did you have to travel for your treatments? And if so, was that a concern for you when you were looking at treatment options, traveling back and forth, room and board, things like that?
Sure. When we first looked at treatment, we looked at all the major brain tumor hospitals in the US and outside of the US. And U of M, Michigan Medicine, was the best suited for my situation. And then we have just stayed within that network. I had to have 2 surgeries before I could start treatment. So we stayed there for the surgeries, and then we were looking at radiation, and I have the best doctor there for radiation with this type of location of tumor. And then my neuro-oncologist had just recently moved from New York to U of M. So we ended up just staying in the state, but it still required a lot of travel from where I live to the hospital. And if you look around and ask friends, there's lots of places to stay that are open to patient discounts, that type of thing. I had just stayed during my second round of radiation. The short version, it's my old employer's neighbor who was on a neighborhood bulletin board, online bulletin board. And so she had put up, is there anything for rent? This woman had contacted her and said, oh, you can just stay at my house for free. So, just the generosity of people everywhere is amazing. But there's resources out there if you can find it, and a lot of the hotels around Michigan Medicine, if you're there for a long time treatment, will have different discounts, rates, that type of thing.
Great, thank you for sharing some of your insight. Kevin, you had mentioned that with the expanded access program, one of the criteria for patients to be eligible is that they are not eligible for clinical trials. How is that determined that a patient isn't eligible for any current clinical trials?
Yeah, another great question. So, the protocols that are established by the pharmaceutical or the biotech companies will have inclusion and exclusion criteria. And unfortunately, that inclusion exclusion criteria can be can be pretty strict, and so it's initially set up by the company, and then how is that determined? Again, it's determined by that criteria within the protocol itself.
Thank you. And then when you say that a patient is not eligible for clinical trials in order to use expanded access, does that refer to all clinical trials or only to those investigation agent of choices for that diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, it's typically for those investigational agents for that particular therapeutic area or disease.
Sure, thank you.
If I could add something there. For instance, the tumor grade, my type of tumor is usually seen in pediatrics. So I was diagnosed like around 25, I think. So I aged out of all the trials that were currently going on at that time. So my doctor and my team had to approach the manufacturer directly and say, Caitlin's too old to be treated as a pediatric patient, but she has this pediatric disease. Can we use this? So there's different ways to go about not fitting those requirements, but it's not things that your family would guess or maybe come up with, because they're so engrossed in how you're doing in your care. You kind of need somebody who is that third party and a step removed.
Thank you for sharing that, Caitlin. And kind of going off of that, oh, did you want to add something, Kevin?
Yeah, I was just going to add something real quick. In relation to, I mean, when you think about clinical trials, I mean, there's clinical trials going on all over the United States and the world for that matter. But within within the United States, let's say there is a clinical trial in the state of California somewhere, say at UCLA. FDA has allowed expanded access even when a patient potentially qualifies for a clinical trial. But if from a geography standpoint and a travel perspective, if it's impossible for the patient to get to that center at UCLA, FDA has allowed expanded access even when patients do qualify for a clinical trial, just because of the burden and difficulty in the travel to get to that particular site.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to build off of that question. One of our attendees here is curious to know, is it the patient's responsibility to research and find out about investigational therapies? Is the physician helping to advocate for the patient? Once they reach that point where they aren't eligible for clinical trials and all alternatives are not working, whose responsibility does it land on, and what resources are available for patients and caregivers as they try to learn more about the options available for them?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for Michigan Medicine and the other team sites. The clinicians at our respective centers absolutely advocate really hard for their patients, and so most of our requests come directly from the clinician, but we do get requests where a patient and their family will approach a clinician, just to echo what Caitlin was mentioning earlier, is ask the questions. And so, there has been a number of cases where the patient and their family went directly to the clinician and said, hey, it doesn't look like I qualify for a clinical trial. Can we try the expanded access pathway? So we see a little bit of both. There are some companies or groups out there that monitor both the clinical trials that are available and also expanded access programs that are available within the United States. So there are groups out there that can help with that. Our resources at Michigan Medicine, if we have a clinician that comes to us and says, hey, we don't have any more options for a specific patient, is there anything we can do? And our team will actually go out, and Caitlin mentioned Misty Gravelin, who is the heart and soul of our expanded access program at Michigan Medicine. I mean, she'll do a lot of that diligence and legwork, to help clinicians and patients seek out alternatives, either through a clinical trial or if there is not a clinical trial available, through the expanded access pathway.
Thank you.
And I think it's, I don't know if small community is the right word, but the type of people that work with expanded access, like Kevin's team and Misty, if you don't know somebody there, and even if they don't know somebody at a specific hospital that you're treating at, a friend is treating at, ask your person anyway, because I had that. I had a friend that passed away from the same tumor that I did. We were pretty much on the same schedule. We'd have the same symptom at the same time. She was treating in New York, did not have an expanded access team. And I asked Misty if she knew anyone in New York who might be able to help. Unfortunately, by the time we found someone who could start her on that path, she was too sick to start treatment. But again, ask the questions, because somebody's going to know somebody in the third degree of separation. They'll find you somebody internationally. I just can't say enough good things about expanded access and the people who work there.
Thank you, Caitlin. That's great advice.
And to that end, Caitlin, thank you for bringing that up. Misty within our team, I mean, she fields questions from all over the country. So, similar to what Caitlin just highlighted, when she reached out to Misty, for her friend that's in New York, we field questions from all over the country, and can definitely help kind of brainstorm and help navigate the process. So that's something we're committed to and we're more than willing to do.
Oh, I've got a friend in Moscow that read an article, Expanded Access / Michigan Medicine wrote on me obtaining my drug. So they wrote that article. The husband did some researching, found a business I had a billion years ago and forgot to take the website down, found my phone number, called me, blah, blah. His wife ended up receiving treatment at Northwestern. So they fly in every, COVID notwithstanding, every 3 months to get more medication and to get an MRI. And she's been stable for a year and a half, which is pretty unheard of.
That's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that story, Caitlin. Kevin, another question we have here is asking, do patients need to undergo a consultation at one of the major team sites in order to obtain assistance with expanded access?
No, not at all. And again, like as I mentioned, I mean, we do field calls from all over the country, and we can help with trying to navigate within their own institution. And I mean, the important component of this is we need a clinician at that institution, to be able to walk through this process. And so again, as Caitlin had mentioned, just continue to ask the questions. And we are delighted to help people walk and navigate the process and identify, sites, if it's a small community hospital, for instance, and they don't have the ability to really support this, we can either try to work with that community hospital, again, to navigate and walk through the process, or potentially, steer them towards a larger medical center, maybe even within the patient's state, to be able to go through that. So no, you don't need to go through one of the team sites to be able to get these consults.
Great. And for patients who are in more rural areas or at smaller community centers, if they wanted to contact your team or reach out to you to field some of these questions, find out information, where can they go? Is there a website or a phone number or email address that they can reach out to for support and help?
Yeah, I mean, Misty and my direct email address is what I would encourage people to use. You know, being remote, I don't think I think Misty would get mad at me if I gave her cell phone number. But we do have a Teams website. It's still under development, so I don't really want to steer people there right now. But I mean, feel free to give anybody that's interested my email address, and then you know, I can direct questions you know, to Misty Gravelin that we keep mentioning. So we would be delighted to field those requests.
Thank you, and we can share that
I
link
told
and
Misty
email address.
that I was going to talk about her, so she's prepared.
That's great. Thank you. All right, let's see. So another question we have here goes back to informed consent. So Kevin, you briefly talked about the importance of informed consent and whether it's required or not in expanded access and right to try. Can you just give a brief overview of what information needs to be shared in order to ensure that informed consent requirements are being met?
Yeah, so it's in the Code of Federal Regulations, the components that have to be in an informed consent. And you know, the right to try law pretty much mimicked what those components of the informed consent need to be. Again, the difference is, you know, under expanded access, that informed consent gets reviewed by an institutional review board to ensure that all of those requirements and elements are within that informed consent. Right to try, because IRB oversight is not needed, the law allows clinicians to develop their own informed consents as long as it has the required elements under the right to try law. And again, the difference is under right to try, there's not another oversight body reviewing that consent, ensuring that all of the elements are there.
Thank you. And earlier in your presentation, Kevin, you had mentioned, you shared a quote about how fewer than 10 people have used right to try to gain access to investigational therapies. Is there any information or background as to why so few people have utilized this?
I think a lot of it goes back to the companies and the manufacture of these products. Because you know, they're so ingrained in going through FDA process as far as drug development is concerned, I think there's a hesitation on the part of the manufacturer to engage right to try, again, specifically because it cuts out the Food and Drug Administration. So I think there's a lot to that aspect. I mean, I'm sure there's some other things swirling around that, but I would probably point to that as being the number one reason why there hasn't been a big uptake in right to try.
Thank you for sharing that. And we have a few people here who are curious to know, Kevin, at your medical facility, the expanded access program, do you see patients who have all types of cancers, you know, including brain tumors, brain metastases, other types of illnesses as well, or is it really focused to a specific disease?
No, it's definitely disease agnostic. You know, I think just the nature of oncology, that's the numbers of cases we support in the oncology setting are the highest. But you know, we do a lot in infectious diseases, cardiac, neurology. So all of the therapeutic areas we definitely cover.
That's great, thank you. And another question we have here is asking, Caitlin, this is for you. You talked about, you know, reaching out to your medical team, reaching out to your family and friends and asking those important questions to get information. Can you share just some advice on what are some important questions that patients and caregivers should be asking in order to get the information that they're looking for from your perspective and your experience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That one I have to think about a little bit because throughout my experience with cancer, I haven't really been asking any questions. I'm a little bit, when I first was diagnosed and that type of thing, I was in too much pain and too drugged up to be conscious enough to ask questions. I was just floating around happy as could be. I think the questions that my family and my team have, when I say team, medical team, family members, community members, there's a lot of different websites for trials, and just that they would research the disease itself. So they take what my medical team would tell them, and then they would break that down. And I have a couple of relatives that are really good at research. So they stayed up till 4 a.m. and they're looking up, is what they're being told accurate? And that's difficult for some people because they might not have the education or the resources to look that up. If you don't, that's okay. You just have to ask of your medical team different questions then. So if somebody says you have a diffuse midline glioma, there's no treatment, you have a year, say, okay, that's, miserable. Who else deals with diffuse midline gliomas? Are there non-medical groups, support groups? And then you'll probably end up getting directed to ABTA. And then ABTA will help you find a support group, or like their mentorship program has been really helpful for me. So I'm paired with somebody who else has a grade 4 diagnosis and is a year or two further along in treatment than I am. So I can ask him questions and go, do you freak out every time you get a scan? And he goes, oh my gosh, yes, for weeks. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. It's not just me. That same partnership is available for your family members too. So if you've got a single mom that's trying to run a house and a job and take care of a sick kid, she's not going to have time. That parent isn't going to have time to look up all of these other things. So who can help? So really just if you don't know what you're looking up, if you don't know how to ask the questions or what questions to ask, look for someone around you, and ABTA is a great place to start. Anybody that you run into at ABTA is incredibly crazy helpful, and if they don't know the answer, they'll find you somebody who does. That's the easiest, shortest way I can answer that question.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I think we'll take just one more question. Kevin, this one is for you. You had mentioned that with expanded access and right to try programs, there's no obligation for the pharma company to provide the drug. Based on that, what would be the protection for patients that their case would even be considered?
Yeah, great question. So, I think there's quite a few things that go into that as far as consideration for providing a product. The first is manufacturing capabilities. I mean, how much supply is there? And manufacturers are not in a position to redeploy investigational product that are already manufactured for those clinical trials. So it's a supply and demand thing, is a big component of that. And and I think where a company is in the development cycle, if they're in late phase 3 clinical trials, the potential is that they would shut down an expanded access program as they close up, their pivotal trials. So I think timing is a aspect of that. Supply and demand, I think, is one of the biggest components of how the manufacturer will address that question of whether someone can engage with their product or not.
Thank you so much. So that is all the time that we have for questions. Thank you again, Kevin and Caitlin, both of you, for taking the time out to share your expertise and insight. And thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, so aside from our educational webinar series, the ABTA has a variety of programs that help support patients and caregivers throughout their experience. For more information about ABTA's programs, events, and services, visit ABTA's website at abta.org, email us at info@abta.org, or call the ABTA Care Line at 1-800-886-2282.